Episode 27, Life in the Era of Expansion, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Over the last few episodes, we've spent a lot of time talking about the Enlightenment, expanding trade, and the Atlantic economy. We've talked about ideas, governments, agriculture, and economics, but this episode is a little different. Today, we're focusing on everyday life in 18th century Europe. What did ordinary people actually experience in their homes, churches, schools, coffeehouses, and cities? How did growing literacy, consumer culture, religion, and medicine shape daily life during this period? Dr. Morgan, Professor Theo, welcome back.
Thanks, Miles.
Glad to be here.
Dr. Morgan, when people hear 18th century Europe, I think they usually imagine powdered wigs and fancy palaces. But most people obviously weren't nobles.
Not even close. Most Europeans still lived in rural villages and worked in agriculture. In many ways, daily life still looked familiar compared to earlier centuries. But at the same time, trade expansion, population growth, and increasing wealth were slowly changing how people lived.
And what makes this chapter interesting is that we start to see changes in culture itself. More people learned to read. More people bought consumer goods. Families began thinking differently about privacy and childhood. Religious life changed, but religion also remained extremely important.
So this is less about kings and wars and more about ordinary people.
Exactly, Miles. Though, of course, politics and economics still shaped all of it.
Well, let's start with schools and literacy, because honestly, I kind of take school for granted.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, elementary education slowly expanded across Europe. Protestant and Catholic states both supported schooling, though often for slightly different reasons. Schools usually focused on religion first, learning prayers, reading scripture, memorizing catechisms, along with basic reading and sometimes arithmetic.
Governments increasingly saw education as useful for the state as well. A more educated population could keep records, work in bureaucracies, and serve the military more effectively. Prussia became especially important here. In the early 18th century, Prussian rulers pushed compulsory elementary education in areas where schools existed. When I've taken student groups to the Frank Foundation school complex in Halle, you can still see how seriously some 18th century German states took education. The buildings themselves reflect this growing belief that governments and religious institutions should shape society through schooling.
Wait, when you say compulsory education, do you mean kids legally had to go to school?
In theory, yes. In practice, enforcement was uneven.
Very uneven. Rural families still depended heavily on child labor. Many children only attended seasonally, and poor families sometimes could not spare the time or money. Education also differed sharply by gender and class.
So it wasn't like modern public school where almost everybody goes every day.
Not at all. But compared to earlier centuries, more ordinary people were learning at least basic literacy skills.
Protestantism played a major role in that growth. Protestants emphasized individual Bible reading, so literacy became tied to salvation and personal religious responsibility.
Commercial growth mattered too. Expanding economies created greater demand for people who could read contracts, keep accounts, or correspond through letters.
How do historians even know literacy rates, though? It's not like people filled out surveys.
Good question. Historians often study marriage records. If someone signed their name instead of making a simple mark, that suggests they could write.
Oh, that's actually kind of clever.
It's imperfect evidence, but it gives historians a rough sense of literacy levels. And by the 18th century, literacy was clearly spreading beyond the nobility and clergy into urban middle classes, artisans, and some skilled workers.
So once more people could read, what were they reading?
A huge variety of things. Newspapers, pamphlets, journals, almanacs, religious texts, novels. Print culture expanded dramatically. As literacy increased, publishers also realized there was growing demand for entertainment. That helped create early forms of genre literature, adventure stories, romances, crime stories, travel narratives, books written not just to educate people, but to entertain them.
Coffee houses and salons became important gathering spaces where people discussed politics, science, and literature. In London, coffee houses were sometimes called penny universities, because for the cost of a cup of coffee, you could participate in discussions about current events.
That honestly does sound kind of like social media.
There are similarities. Information spread faster, rumors circulated widely, and public debate expanded. But communication was obviously much slower than today, and literacy still remained limited.
Governments also worried about the political consequences of print culture. Rulers understood that pamphlets and newspapers could spread criticism of governments, monarchs, or churches.
So Enlightenment ideas spread partly because there were more people reading them?
Exactly. The growth of print culture helped create what historians call public opinion.
And people often read collectively. One person might read a newspaper aloud in a tavern or coffee house, while others listened. Reading was still frequently a social activity.
I always imagine reading as kind of private.
That idea of privacy was also changing during this period. The rise of novels and sentimental literature encouraged readers to think more about personal emotions, family relationships, and inner feelings.
Is this where Rousseau comes in again?
Very much so. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that childhood was a special stage of life, and that education should nurture natural human emotions rather than simply enforce discipline.
His ideas influenced elite attitudes toward parenting and family life across Europe.
Why did novels matter so much, though? They're just stories.
Stories shape how people imagine themselves and others. Novels encouraged readers to sympathize with characters and reflect on private emotions. That helped reshape ideas about morality, marriage, and domestic life. In some ways, you can trace later European cinema back to these emotional storytelling traditions. Like in Vittorio De Sica's 1948 film called The Bicycle Thief, focused heavily on ordinary people, emotional struggle, and intimate family life. That interest in personal experience has roots in 18th century cultural changes.
So people are becoming more focused on the individual?
Slowly, yes, especially among educated and urban groups.
Speaking of urban groups, this chapter talks a lot about consumer culture too.
Right? Historians often call this the consumer revolution. Expanding trade networks brought increasing amounts of goods into Europe: sugar, tea, coffee, tobacco, porcelain, cotton textiles.
Which all connects back to empire and slavery.
Directly. European consumer culture depended heavily on colonial systems and enslaved labor. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, for example, produced goods consumed in European homes and coffee houses.
Could ordinary people actually afford these products?
Increasingly, yes. Not everyone, of course, but expanding trade lowered prices and created cheaper versions of goods once limited to elites.
Fashion became especially important. Clothing increasingly reflected identity, status, and respectability.
People judged each other based on what they wore?
Absolutely. And this worried some elites because fashionable clothing blurred class distinctions. Wealthy observers sometimes complained that servants or laborers dressed above their social station.
Governments occasionally worried about imports as well. Mercantilist policies tried to protect domestic industries and control trade.
Shops also became more elaborate. Window displays, advertisements, and consumer marketing expanded. Shopping itself increasingly became part of urban public life.
So this is kind of the beginning of modern consumer culture.
In many ways, yes.
The textbook also talks about privacy changing.
Homes gradually changed among wealthier families. Instead of a few shared multifunctional rooms, houses increasingly developed specialized spaces: dining rooms, parlors, private bedrooms.
That sounds normal to us now, but I guess it wasn't then.
Exactly. Greater attention to privacy and domestic comfort reflected changing attitudes about family life and individuality.
Was that true for poor people too?
Usually not. Many poor families still lived in crowded conditions with very limited privacy. It's important not to imagine all Europeans experiencing these changes equally.
So while some people are buying porcelain and reading novels, other people are still struggling just to survive.
Very much so.
One thing I found interesting in this chapter is that even with the Enlightenment criticizing religion, religion still seems incredibly important.
It remained central to most people's lives. Church attendance, religious holidays, baptisms, marriages, funerals. Religion shaped the rhythm of life across Europe.
States also relied heavily on religion. Churches kept records, ran schools, and provided poor relief. Political authority and religious authority were still deeply connected.
So the Enlightenment didn't suddenly make everybody secular.
Not remotely. Most Europeans in the 18th century remained deeply religious. Catholic reform efforts continued after the Counter-Reformation, while Protestant churches emphasized education and moral discipline.
The chapter also mentions Pietism and Methodism. What exactly was Methodism?
Methodism began within the Church of England under John Wesley. It emphasized emotional preaching, personal devotion, and moral self-discipline.
Emotional preaching meaning what exactly?
Sermons that focused less on formal ritual and more on personal religious experience. Methodist gatherings could be highly emotional.
Methodism also spread effectively among working populations in Britain during early industrialization. Religious discipline sometimes helped create social stability in rapidly changing communities.
So religion was adapting to social change instead of disappearing.
That's a great way to put it.
Enlightenment ideas did encourage some rulers to support limited religious toleration, though. Joseph II in the Habsburg Empire relaxed some restrictions on Protestants and Jews.
Was that because he believed everybody was equal?
Usually it was more practical than ideological. Toleration could strengthen the economy or make governing easier.
And prejudice certainly did not disappear. Jewish communities still faced major restrictions and discrimination across much of Europe.
All right, let's talk about medicine because honestly, 18th century medicine sounds terrifying.
In many cases it was. Traditional medicine still dominated. Doctors used bloodletting, herbal remedies, and treatments that often had limited effectiveness.
Honestly, that doesn't sound that different from what we talked about during the Black Death.
In some ways it wasn't, Miles. European medicine had improved somewhat since the 14th century, but doctors still lacked an understanding of bacteria, viruses, or germ theory. That limited what they could actually do for many diseases.
Did doctors actually help people?
Sometimes. But many treatments could also be ineffective or harmful. People often trusted family remedies or local healers as much as trained physicians.
Still, the scientific revolution slowly influenced medicine. Anatomical knowledge improved, and hospitals expanded in major cities. In Paris, for example, when visiting old hospital complexes with students, you can really see how cities increasingly tried to organize care for growing urban populations.
Though hospitals mostly served the poor, wealthier patients usually received treatment at home.
The smallpox section really stood out to me.
Smallpox was one of the deadliest diseases in the world. In the 18th century, Europeans learned more about variolation, a technique observed in the Ottoman Empire.
That's where they deliberately infected someone with a mild version, right?
Essentially, yes. Material from smallpox sores was introduced into the body in hopes of creating immunity.
That sounds unbelievably risky.
It was risky, but full smallpox infection was often even deadlier.
Lady Mary Wortley Montagu helped popularize variolation in Britain after observing the practice in Constantinople.
What's the difference between variolation and vaccination?
Variolation used actual smallpox material. Vaccination, developed later by Edward Jenner, used cowpox instead.
Jenner's method was much safer and became one of the earliest major breakthroughs in preventive medicine.
Did people understand germs yet?
No, germ theory would not emerge until the 19th century.
Cities still struggled with sewage, contaminated water, overcrowding, and disease.
So even though medicine was improving, cities could still be incredibly unhealthy.
Exactly.
But governments and medical officials increasingly recognized that public health mattered. That gradual shift would become much more important during the Industrial Revolution.
Well, I think one thing that really stands out in this episode is that 18th century Europe feels both modern and pre-modern at the same time.
That's an excellent observation, Miles.
You have rising literacy, newspapers, consumer culture, and early public health reforms. But at the same time, most people are still deeply religious, medicine is still pretty limited, and social inequality is everywhere.
Change happened unevenly. Class, gender, and geography all shaped people's experiences.
But these social and cultural changes were still incredibly important because they helped create the world that would eventually experience political revolution and industrialization.
Next episode, we'll begin our exploration of the Atlantic revolutions and look at the causes of the American and French revolutions. Thanks for listening to The Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.